It's nice to listen to the music of the bells. It's also nice when you live in community to see your friends, your neighbors, your fellow church members when they nail a piece. And you can be excited for them that they just did really, really well. It was so great from my point of view to be able to see Richard encouraging the bell choir. I understand he has his back to many of you. When the song ends and he breaks into a smile and it's like, you all nailed it. So this is going to be a horrible segue. No doubt the Crusaders cheered. Francis of Assisi had just come into town to see some action in the Fifth Great Crusade. Like I said, this is a horrible segue. See some action in the Fifth Great Crusade about 800 years ago. The Crusaders, the Christians, had the Muslims on the back foot in Jerusalem, laying siege to the point that Sultan al-Kamil was trying to negotiate the best deal possible for a mostly defeated people. Francis had come because he heard that this was a great opportunity to live out what Christians have called the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all the nations. Jesus tells his followers right before the end of the Gospel of Matthew. A Hindu friend in college once told me that he didn't mind Jesus. He was mostly okay with what Jesus had to say, mostly. But he said it was really hard to pick apart the difference between Jesus and some of his followers who were such a pain in the neck. Why, he asked, do you all feel the need to proselytize so much? It makes you all seem so desperate. Oh, I said, don't lump me in with those people. It's just that Jesus told us to go and make disciples of all the nations. And so these folks that you're talking about are simply being obedient. Well, my friend said, maybe Jesus wasn't so great after all. St. Francis managed to talk his way into meeting with Sultan al-Kamil, who believed that Francis had come to negotiate on behalf of all Christians. His clerks and servants and soldiers were pretty astonished when Francis showed absolutely no inclination toward negotiating and set out to tell al-Kamil about all the problems with Islam, even as he demonstrated that he didn't know very much about Islam. Al-Kamil's guards sought to kill Francis right where he stood. Thankfully, al-Kamil thought it would do him little good in negotiations if he offed the other guy's holy man. Up against the wall, al-Kamil decided, though, that Jesus just wasn't for him. Matthew 28 was burned into my consciousness as a teenager, even when it made me feel kind of lousy. I did my best, some of you might remember this about me, that I tried my hand at making disciples of all the nations by accosting Jewish people on the golf course I played with my dad as a teenager. My conversion rate was about as good as St. Francis of Assisi's. These verses that we heard today have held special sway in Christianity for many years. We know that the consequences have usually been quite awful. For people around the world who were under the boot of imperialism and made to convert, or told to hide their native traditions, or just treated as inferior by missionaries and conquerors. Jesus, the one who appears in the midst of an empire which lives and breathes and exists because of victory through conquest, is now remade by Christians over the centuries to be the one who approves of conquest, just in his name instead of Caesar's. I don't know about you, but this seems completely at odds with my understanding of who Jesus was and what he taught. Doesn't it seem strange to you that the guy who taught, "Blessed are the meek," might sanction running all over the world and knocking people upside the head with the news that the meek are blessed? Does it seem strange to you that the guy who seems to have a preferential option for those who are in distress and those who are sick and those who have been displaced is now, at the end of the gospel story, mostly interested in accumulating the biggest team possible? Does it seem strange that the man who seemed concretely interested in this life and how to live in this world, right here, right now, who taught an ethic for living life, would now be interested in communicating a message that primarily exists around what happens to you after you die, and it is your responsibility to teach others about that? If it looks and sounds like I'm undercutting the Great Commission, some of you might be pretty happy about this. Well, I wasn't all that interested in going and making disciples of all nations anyway. I'm pretty happy where I am. Thank you very much. There is only so much time in my week. I'm not questioning whether you should live out the Great Commission. What I'm questioning is whether there is a Great Commission. Go and make disciples. How can you read that as anything but an order? An imperative. The problem for us is that in the Greek, in the New Testament, it isn't an imperative. It is not an order. The phrase is not an imperative. It is a participle. In English, that means rather than go or you must go, it means while going or as you go, make disciples. And make disciples, that is just a single verb, to disciple. So the Great Commission is not an order to go and make people something, but a reference to you and for you for how to live as you go on your way. While going, disciple the nations. I hear that as where you now find yourselves, live your lives as disciples. Why would that be hard? Well, for the 11 people on the receiving end of this bit of wisdom, they have just seen Jesus executed. They have seen Jesus risen from the dead. And now the gospel says that they're about to be left alone again. Jesus, as pastor, as friend, as beloved leader of this community, offers words of encouragement to live out the ethics. What ethics? The ethics of the Sermon on the Mount at a time where he also tells them that he has authority from heaven. He has authority in a place where Caesar is the only one with authority, not anybody else, where Caesar is divine and not anybody else, and where Caesar has just attempted another victory by putting Jesus on a cross. In the midst of all this turbulence and all this fright and all this bewilderment and sense of abandonment, the 11 disciples are now encouraged to do what? In order to take the next step, live out the ethics of discipleship as they go. I told you about my own attempts at evangelism earlier. I also helped run Vacation Bible School for kids when I was a senior in high school in Florida. That was an exercise that was supposed to bring children to Jesus in a 5-part color-coded lesson. If you were adequate at running Vacation Bible School, you brought 1 or 2 kids into the fold between 9 and noon. If you were really good at it, you got 8 to 10. I wonder if it would have made any difference to us if there were actually no Great Commission. I wonder if Christians would have just done the exact same thing for the last 1,700 years or so, no matter what the Bible said about going and making disciples. Of course, if you think that there is a concrete difference between go and make and as you go disciple people, or while going disciple people, then perhaps you're left wondering about a lot of things that Jesus said or was reported to have said. Perhaps you've got a ton of doubts about the capacity of the Gospels, the capacity of the good news to transform lives here and now. And perhaps your faith has twisted and turned so much that you're not really sure what to believe with complete certainty anymore. And you sure aren't ready, you know this, you sure aren't ready to ask someone else to change their point of view if you're not fundamentally clear on what your own point of view is. You may well feel like you're living at the edge of something, the edge of the place between belief and unbelief. The belief in the majesty of God's power and goodness with your toes wrapped around the line, with the other side being that God seems fairly ineffective at preventing tragedy and sickness. Perhaps you're occupying the edge with one side being secular life and the other Christendom. Or one side being, you notice that your family is really a great part of this culture and you always don't seem to mesh well with that culture. You're not at the center of anything except perhaps your own family, and maybe not even that. But you're not alone. In fact, if you find yourself on the edge between faith and doubt, you can know that the very people who are reported to physically be with Jesus here in the story, they are in a world of doubt themselves. When they saw him, the text says they worshipped him, but some doubted. I loved when Jane paused before, but some doubted. Some translators believe that is too soft of an emphasis on the doubt, that it should be, when they saw him, they worshipped, but they doubted. All of them worshipped and doubted in the same moment. Frederick Buechner once said that doubts are the ants in the pants of your faith. They keep it awake and they keep you moving. Which is perhaps mildly humorous and maybe nice, a nice thought, but when you actually have ants in your pants, it isn't so funny. When it's you that's jumping up and down and swatting at your legs and your ankles, it is not humorous. Do you feel alone in your doubts? Your doubts about God and who God is and what God is? Do you feel alone in your doubts about love and about the goodness of life? You're not alone if you do. The disciples of Christ did as well, and many of the disciples in this place today, they too feel that way. And I can't just give you words and assuage those doubts. But it does help me to complete Jesus' thought. While going, he says, disciple others, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. He has already said that all authority has been given to him and not Caesar. And now he encourages baptism and a particular kind of baptism. Don't baptize them for the repentance, for the forgiveness of sins like John the Baptist. Don't baptize them in the ethics of the empire. Don't baptize them to conform to the world, and in this world where Caesar is the one with authority and Caesar is the one whose empire stands on 4 pillars or principles. Don't baptize them in the principles of the empire, being patriarchy, slavery, hierarchy, and victory through conquest. Jesus encourages a baptism not in the name of Caesar and not in the name of those values, but in the name of the Creator and Christ and Spirit, where the meek are blessed, and those who mourn are upheld, and the poor and poor in spirit are righteous, and of a kingdom where people are good enough and where there is always enough of love and light and healing. Many of us in this place today are still reeling from Thursday night. Reeling about the news of Mary. We are here and we are worshiping and we are doubting all at the same time, celebrating and mourning at the same time, feeling grateful and bitter all at the same time, for knowing that the way things are sometimes deeply unfair. I live believing in a kingdom that God's heart broke first for Mary and for her family, and for the driver of that vehicle and for her family. I believe faith is not belief in a God that organizes this pain and that hurt and this kind of wound. Faith comes about and is given fuel by being grasped by the power of love, by belief in our capacity to be engulfed by light, by our Creator, by a belief that life isn't lived at the center of anything except my community. And while I'm also living on the edge of belief and unbelief, the edge of belief in the majesty and goodness of God's power, the edge of Christendom, the edge of what might be considered mainstream. Go and make disciples? For those who are worshiping and doubting, Jesus encourages them not to go and make disciples, but encourages them and us to be disciples. and to help others struggling on the journey of discipleship, reminding them that their baptism is built on a worldview that has nothing to do with conquest and everything to do with peaceableness. It has nothing to do with hierarchy or slavery or patriarchy, and everything to do with the belief in the value of every human being. For this is the good news that comes to us in the midst of our worship and our doubt, that God is a God of abundance, an abundance of love and light and goodness, even when we hurt, especially when we hurt, especially when we mourn, and especially when we doubt. I don't believe in the Great Commission anymore. I do believe in the ethics of the kingdom and the good news of God's abundance. I do believe in the call to love my neighbor in the midst of their and my own bewilderment about the world. Wherever I go, thanks to God and thanks to all of you, there love is. May God's peace be with you all. Amen.